Okay, let's get started. I'm going to give you today some highlights of a research project I've been working on for several years now. It looks at the character traits of Christians as well as their lifestyle. And it's this latter piece, this lifestyle piece, that I want to focus on for a few minutes. And in particular, the extent to which followers of Jesus Christ say that they feel overloaded or too busy, too hurried in life, and why that matters. And if you have questions about any of these slides along the way, just stop me because I'm probably going to go pretty fast through them. First, here's an overview of the data set. What I'm going to show you in the next several slides is based on data anonymously submitted to me by more than 12,000 Christians around the world. That's approximately 8,000 women and 4,000 men between the ages of 15 and 88. And as you can see, they represent almost 50 denominations. About 7 out of 10 of the survey respondents are Caucasian, and about 8 in 10 come from the United States. But still, with a data set of this size, that means that about 2,100 respondents are from outside the U.S., from the rest of North America, as well as from Asia, Europe, South America, Australia, and Africa. Okay, in this particular survey, we collected information about many aspects of Christians' lives, including these 3 items on the slide. As you see, they're survey items about how hurried and overloaded people feel. And I asked these folks to indicate to what extent each survey statement was true of them. And they selected from 5 options. This statement is never true of me. This statement is rarely true of me. It's sometimes true, it's often true, or it's always true of me. And what you're going to see in the right column is the percentage who say that the statement is often or always true of them. Basically the ones who say, yeah, that's me most of the time. So for this first item, we found that 30% of Christians in this study say that they often or always feel guilty when they relax. Almost 1 in 3. Big deal? No big deal? Well, maybe not. But think about that being the default condition in your life, as it is for these folks. That sounds like a pretty hard place to live. For the second item, we found that almost 1 in 2 Christians, 48%, say that they usually rush from task to task and that it's become a lifestyle for them. Now, that one might sound a bit more surprising, so let's dig into it a little bit deeper. If you think that this hurry is essentially a North American problem, check this out. Clearly it's not. A sizable percentage of Christians from Asia, from Australia, from Europe as well, also say that they usually rush from task to task. More precisely, that this is often or always true of them. Okay, next slide. There's also enough data here to examine how the problem varies by profession. Now, to date, I've only analyzed a handful of professions, as you can see on the slide, but they're specifically the ones that have well over 100 respondents. But what we're seeing so far is that the 300 plus pastors in this data set are the ones who report the greatest challenge, and with a whopping 54% of them saying that they often or always feel like they're in a rush. But they're followed pretty closely by people identifying themselves as managers, business owners, teachers, salespeople, and lawyers. And how scary is this? 4 in 10 of our nurses say that they're usually rushing from task to task. And even a full 1/3 of those who say that they're retired are in this accelerated lifestyle. I don't know, maybe it's that old habits are hard to break, but to me that's pretty striking and maybe a bit depressing as well. I hope it's not a crystal ball for our future. But anyway, here's something else that might be striking. More than half of the Christians in this survey say that as a result of their overloaded lifestyle, they're often or always exhausted at the end of their day. And we'll see shortly why that's potentially a problem. But first, look at this line chart that breaks out that question by age and by gender. On the x-axis here, we have the age groups from teens all the way through senior citizens. And on the y-axis is the percentage of Christians in each of these age groups who say that they're usually exhausted at the end of their day. Now, a couple of things seem to jump off the page. First, for both men and women, the overload problem seems to grow through our 20s and then peaks during our 30s. Maybe not that much of a surprise, since many people in this stage of life are getting married and starting families, buying houses and developing their careers, taking on more responsibilities at work, maybe even going to grad school as well. Then the problem seems to abate after that through our 40s and 50s, but only gradually. Something else that's apparent, and you probably noticed this right away, is that at every stage of life, women report feeling more overloaded and more exhausted than men do. It's remarkable how consistent this gender gap is here from our teenage years all the way into our 60s. And I don't yet have the data to explain why there's a gap, so unfortunately that provocative question is something we're going to have to leave for another time. Okay, now what about the consequences of all this reported overload? First, and I guess this is a bit obvious, there are physical manifestations like the fatigue we've just been discussing, as well as stress and high blood pressure, headaches, and so on. Actually, in Japan, this aspect of the problem is so bad that there's even a special word for it, karoshi, which literally means death from overwork. I mean, seemingly healthy people, typically men in their 30s and 40s, just dying suddenly from stress-related heart attack or stroke because they've been working more than 100 hours a week for years. Now, that's an extreme, but I think you get the point, right? I mean, there are clear, malicious, physical consequences to an overloaded life. There are also relational consequences. In fact, here's the reality. Just about every relationship we have is compromised when we're consistently overloaded. From relationship with our family to the relationships with our colleagues in the workplace to our neighbors to our friends. Why? Well, it's kind of obvious, right? It takes time to develop and sustain relationships, to listen to people and to take care of their needs. And time is the one commodity that overloaded people don't have. Beyond that, our hurry and stress can also cause us to be more terse and impatient with people, which can further undermine our relationships. So ultimately, a lot of overloaded people experience a life of alienation from those around them. They're surrounded by people all day long, but paradoxically, they're incredibly lonely. And there's more. Besides the physical and relational consequences of an overloaded life, there's what we might call the professional consequences or the productivity consequences. And you've probably experienced some of this as students trying to take 5 classes at the same time while adding in extracurriculars and all the social aspects of college and a dozen other things that you're trying to juggle every day. And see if this doesn't sound familiar. When we're doing too many things, we often do many of those tasks with mediocrity rather than with excellence, simply to get it done and to move on to the next thing, right? I mean, social scientists, they have a word for this. They call it satisficing, which is not really a word. It's actually a combination of the words satisfy and suffice. Satisficing. But the point is that it's become part of the human condition. And here's some quick insight into the problem from a psychologist by the name of Edward Hallowell, writing in Harvard Business Review. He says this about the professional consequences of overload. He says the sufferer of overload, doesn't experience a single crisis, but rather a series of minor emergencies while he or she tries harder and harder to keep up. Shouldering a responsibility to suck it up and not complain as the workload increases, executives, or really anyone with this condition, do whatever they can to handle a load they simply cannot manage as well as they'd like. The sufferer therefore feels a constant low level of panic and guilt. Facing a tidal wave of tasks, the executive becomes increasingly hurried, curt, peremptory, and unfocused while pretending that everything is fine. Man, any pretenders in here? No, you don't need to answer. I'm just sort of asking rhetorically, but I suspect that this resonates with more than a few of us in here who have had to settle for doing things at 80% instead of being able to consistently give our best. And it's especially disconcerting when this happens to followers of Jesus, people who are to work for God in all that we do. I mean, we have no business doing anything with mediocrity, much less everything. One last thought about professional consequences. Dr. Hallowell in this article goes a step further with this, identifying some of the consequences for any company or school or church or any other organization that overloads its people. He says, All too often, companies induce and exacerbate overload in their employees by demanding fast thinking rather than deep thinking. Firms also ask employees to work on multiple overlapping projects and initiatives, resulting in second-rate thinking. Worse, companies that ask their employees to do too much at once tend to reward those who say yes to overload while punishing those who choose to focus and say no. Additionally, firms that ignore the symptoms in their employees suffer its ill effects. Employees underachieve, create clutter, cut corners, make careless mistakes, and squander their brain power. You see, at both the individual level and the corporate level, overload can lead to underperformance. That's the main point here. We do much better, it seems, if we preserve the simplicity to excel. But more on that another time. We need to finish this up first. As if the physical and relational and professional consequences of overload weren't enough, there's also arguably the most egregious outcome of all. You might call it the spiritual consequences. A lot of us, it seems, may be too busy for God. Here's what I mean. I asked my 12,000 respondents about this issue, and it turns out that 6 out of 10 Christians in this study report that often or always, the busyness of their life gets in the way of developing their relationship with God. 6 out of 10, 61%. We're called to this continual communion with God. We talk about this all the time. But for many of us, instead, what we get is continual distraction from God. And this might be maybe the most important finding in the study so far. And again, we see that it's a global finding. I analyzed these data by country, and we see that being distracted from God is, just like we said earlier, not a uniquely American or North American or even Western problem, but a worldwide problem. A lot of countries clustered around this 6 in 10 average. One last slide, although there's clearly a lot further that we could go with this. Just like before, I looked at this survey item across professions, and here's what I found. Who's too busy for God? Here it seems that it's the lawyers who claim that dubious honor. But you don't have to go too far down this chart to again find our pastors. 65% of them, about 2 out of every 3 pastors in this study, say that even their busyness gets in the way of their life with God. Now, that's kind of a sad irony, I think. Right? Since the very people who might help us to escape from this bondage of busyness and overload also seem to be in chains. They also seem to be afflicted. They also seem to be undermined by this problem. Now, last comment. Please recognize that these are just preliminary conclusions. The research study is ongoing, and we have to be cautious when interpreting these kind of data. But at present, the research is uncovering a widespread and pernicious problem.